The stagecoach hit another rut in the dusty Montana road, and Clara Lindström clutched her carpetbag tighter as her stomach twisted with a fear that had nothing to do with the rough journey from St. Louis. She had traveled over 2,000 miles to marry a man she had never met. And now, as the summer heat of 1882 beat down on the coach's roof, she could barely form a simple English sentence without her thick Swedish accent transforming every word into something awkward and embarrassing. The other passengers had stopped trying to make conversation with her 3 days ago, their polite smiles fading into uncomfortable silence whenever she attempted to respond. And Clara had retreated into herself, speaking only when absolutely necessary, her cheeks burning with shame each time she mangled another phrase. The advertisement had seemed like a miracle when she had seen it in the Swedish language newspaper in New York. A rancher in Silver Bend, Montana, seeking a hard-working wife. No mention of needing perfect English, no requirement to be anything other than honest and willing to build a life together. Clara had written her response in careful, painstaking English, spending hours with her dictionary to make sure every word was correct on paper. But writing and speaking were two vastly different things, and now she wondered if Thomas Garrett, her intended husband, would take one look at her, listen to her stumble through a greeting, and send her right back east. She was 22 years old, alone in a country that still felt foreign despite the 3 years she had spent in New York working in a textile factory. Her parents had died during the crossing from Sweden, victims of the fever that swept through steerage, and Clara had arrived in America an orphan with nothing but determination, and the small amount of money her father had sewn into the lining of her coat. She had worked hard, saved every penny she could, but the city had felt like a prison of noise and smoke and endless rows of tenement buildings. The idea of open land, fresh air, and a chance to build something real had called to something deep in her soul. The stagecoach began to slow, and the driver called out that they were approaching Silver Bend. Clara's heart hammered against her ribs as she smoothed down her gray traveling dress, worn but clean, and adjusted her bonnet. Through the window, she could see a small town taking shape. A main street with wooden buildings, a general store, a saloon, a church with a white steeple, and clusters of houses spreading out toward the rolling grasslands beyond. Mountains rose in the distance, their peaks still touched with snow despite the summer heat. When the coach finally stopped in front of the general store, Clara waited for the other passengers to disembark first, her hands trembling as she gathered her belongings. She had one trunk strapped to the back of the coach, containing everything she owned in the world. Clothes she had sewn herself, her mother's wedding shawl, a few books in Swedish, and a small wooden box with her parents' wedding rings. The driver helped her down, and Clara stood on the dusty street, squinting in the bright sunlight. Her instructions had been simple. Meet Thomas Garrett at the general store at 3 o'clock on June 15th. She had no idea what he looked like beyond his description in his letters. Tall, dark-haired, 30 years old, owner of the Double G Ranch 5 miles outside of town. A group of men stood outside the saloon, watching the new arrivals with interest. Clara kept her eyes down, feeling their stares like physical touches. She had learned quickly that a woman alone drew attention and not always the kind sort. "Miss Lindström," the voice came from behind her, deep and slightly hesitant. Clara turned and found herself looking up at a man who matched Thomas Garrett's description, but somehow seemed more real and intimidating in person. He was tall, easily over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and sun-bronzed skin that spoke of years working outdoors. His dark hair curled slightly under his hat, and his eyes were a striking shade of blue-gray that reminded her of the sky before a storm. He wore typical ranch clothes: denim pants, a worn cotton shirt, a leather vest, and a bandana tied loosely around his neck. Dust covered his boots, and he held his hat in his hands, turning it nervously. Clara's mouth went dry. She tried to speak, to give the greeting she had practiced 100 times, but her tongue felt thick and clumsy. Why, yes, I am she, Clara. The words came out mangled, her vowels too round, her consonants harsh. Even those simple words sounded wrong to her own ears. Thomas Garrett's expression shifted slightly, but Clara could not read it. Surprise, disappointment. She felt heat rise in her cheeks and looked down at her feet, mortified. "Welcome to Silver Bend," Thomas said, his voice gentler than before. "I hope your journey was not too difficult." Clara forced herself to look up to meet his eyes. She owed him that much at least. "The journey was long, but I am here now." Each word felt like a struggle, her accent wrapping around the English like vines around a fence post, choking the proper sounds. She waited for him to flinch, to show some sign of disappointment or frustration. Instead, Thomas Garrett simply nodded and gestured toward a wagon parked nearby. "Let me get your trunk. You must be tired and hungry. My ranch is not far, and my housekeeper, Mrs. Chen, has prepared a room for you." Clara watched as he moved to retrieve her trunk from the back of the stagecoach, his movements efficient and strong. The driver helped him load it onto the wagon, and then Thomas turned back to her, offering his hand to help her up onto the wagon seat. His hand was calloused and warm, and Clara felt a strange jolt at the contact. She settled onto the seat, arranging her skirts, and Thomas climbed up beside her, taking the reins. As they pulled away from the general store, Clara was acutely aware of the people watching them. Women whispering behind their hands, men nodding to Thomas with knowing grins. The silence between them stretched uncomfortably as the wagon rolled out of town. Clara wanted to say something, anything, to break the tension, but fear kept her mouth shut. What if she said something so garbled he could not understand her at all? What if he decided right then that he had made a terrible mistake? "The ranch has been in my family for 10 years, Thomas said finally, his eyes on the road ahead. "My father started it, but he passed 5 years ago. My mother went back east to live with her sister. It is just me now, and 3 ranch hands who help with the cattle and horses." Clara nodded, not trusting herself to respond with more than a murmur of acknowledgement. Thomas glanced at her, and she saw something in his expression that might have been concern. "I know this must be overwhelming. Coming all this way to marry a stranger, I want you to know that there is no pressure. Mrs. Chen has prepared a separate room for you. We can take time to get to know each other before we make anything official." Relief flooded through Clara, so intense she felt tears prick her eyes. She had been terrified that he would expect her to marry him immediately, that very day, with no chance to even catch her breath. "Thank you," she whispered, the words barely audible. They rode in silence for another mile, the wagon creaking and swaying over the uneven road. The landscape opened up around them, vast and beautiful in a way that made Clara's heart ache. Rolling grasslands stretched to the horizon, dotted with wildflowers and the occasional cluster of trees. Cattle grazed in the distance, and birds wheeled overhead in the endless blue sky. "Do you like it?" Thomas asked, and Clara turned to find him watching her with an expression she could not quite read. "It is." Clara searched for the English words, her frustration mounting. In Swedish, she could express the beauty, the sense of space and freedom, the way the land seemed to breathe with possibility. In English, she could only manage. "It is very big, beautiful." Thomas smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his serious face. "It is big. Sometimes too big when you are trying to round up strays, but I love it. Could not imagine living anywhere else." Clara wanted to tell him that she understood, that she had felt trapped in New York and had dreamed of exactly this kind of openness. But the words tangled in her mind, and she remained silent, hating herself for her cowardice. The ranch came into view over a rise. A sturdy 2-story house with a wide porch, a large barn, several outbuildings, and a network of corrals and fences. It looked well-maintained and prosperous, and Clara felt another flutter of relief. At least she would not be struggling to survive in a falling-down shack. As they approached, a Chinese woman in her 50s emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Thomas pulled the wagon to a stop and jumped down, then came around to help Clara descend. Mrs. Chen, this is Miss Lindström, Thomas said, and the housekeeper's weathered face broke into a warm smile. Welcome, welcome, Mrs. Chen said, her own accent coloring the words. She reached out and took Clara's hands in both of hers, squeezing gently. You must be very tired. Come, I show you your room, get you something to eat. Clara felt tears threaten again at the kindness in the woman's face. Thank you, she managed, and Mrs. Chen simply nodded as if she understood everything Clara could not say. Thomas carried Clara's trunk inside, and she followed Mrs. Chen through a comfortable living room with sturdy furniture and colorful rugs, up a flight of stairs, and down a hallway to a pleasant bedroom with windows overlooking the front of the property. The room was simple but clean, with a bed covered in a handmade quilt, a dresser, a washstand, and a rocking chair by the window. You rest, Mrs. Chen said firmly. I bring you food soon, then tonight dinner with Mr. Thomas. Clara nodded gratefully and sank onto the bed as Mrs. Chen bustled out. Through the window, she could see Thomas unhitching the horses from the wagon, his movements practiced and easy. She watched him for a long moment, trying to sort through the confusion of emotions swirling in her chest. He had been kind, more than kind. He had not mocked her accent or shown impatience when she struggled with her words. But kindness was one thing, building a life together was quite another. How could they have a real marriage if she could barely communicate with him? How could he come to care for her if every conversation was a painful exercise in frustration? Clara lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling, and allowed herself a few tears of exhaustion and fear before she pulled herself together. She had not come all this way to give up at the first challenge. She would simply have to try harder, practice more, force herself to speak even when it was uncomfortable. But even as she made that resolution, shame burned in her chest at the thought of mangling more words in front of Thomas Garrett's patient, watching eyes. Mrs. Chen brought her a tray with bread, cheese, cold chicken, and fresh milk, and Clara ate hungrily, realizing she had barely touched food all day. Afterward, she unpacked her trunk, hanging her few dresses in the small wardrobe and arranging her personal items on the dresser. She took special care with her mother's shawl, folding it gently and laying it in the bottom drawer. As the sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and gold, Mrs. Chen knocked on her door. Dinner soon. You come down when ready. Clara washed her face and hands, changed into her best dress, a dark blue cotton with white trim at the collar and cuffs, and braided her blonde hair, pinning it in a coronet around her head. She looked at herself in the small mirror above the dresser and saw a pale, anxious young woman staring back. Taking a deep breath, she squared her shoulders and headed downstairs. The dining room was modest but welcoming, with a table that could seat 8 and windows that let in the last golden light of day. Thomas was already there, standing by the window, and he turned as she entered. He had cleaned up as well, his hair damp from washing, wearing a clean shirt. Please sit, he said, gesturing to the table, and Clara took a seat as Mrs. Chen began bringing out dishes. Roasted beef, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread, and butter. Thomas sat across from her, and for a moment they simply looked at each other. Then he cleared his throat. I thought we could talk a bit, get to know each other, if that is all right with you. Clara nodded, her hands clenched in her lap under the table. Your letters were very well written, Thomas said, serving her some beef and vegetables. You said you worked in a textile factory in New York. Yes, Clara said carefully. For 3 years, sewing long hours. She hated how simple she sounded, like a child instead of a grown woman. That must have been difficult work, Thomas said, and there was genuine sympathy in his voice. I have heard the factories in the East are harsh places. Clara nodded, wanting to tell him about the endless noise, the lint that filled the air and made everyone cough, the exhaustion that went bone deep. But she could not find the words, and the silence stretched between them again. Thomas seemed to sense her frustration. He set down his fork and leaned forward slightly. Miss Lindström, I need to say something, and I hope you will not take offense. Clara's heart sank. Here it came, the polite dismissal, the explanation that this arrangement would not work after all. "I notice that you seem uncomfortable speaking," Thomas continued, his eyes steady on hers. "And I think maybe it is because of your accent. I want you to know something." He paused, as if choosing his words carefully. "Say anything and I will listen. I do not care how the words sound." "I care what you are trying to tell me. Your accent is part of who you are, and I would never want you to feel ashamed of it." Clara stared at him, unable to believe what she was hearing. In the 3 years she had been in America, no one had ever said anything like that to her. Most people had been impatient, asking her to repeat herself or simply giving up on conversation altogether. Some had been outright cruel, mocking the way she spoke. "I mean it," Thomas said, his voice gentle but firm. "I know I am just a rancher, not an educated man, but I understand that learning a new language is hard. You are brave for trying, for coming all this way. The least I can do is listen with patience." Tears filled Clara's eyes before she could stop them, spilling down her cheeks. She wiped at them hastily, embarrassed by this display of emotion, but Thomas simply handed her his handkerchief without comment. "I am sorry," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I am not usually. I do not cry like this." "You have had a long journey," Thomas said. "And I imagine you are carrying a lot of worry. It is all right." Clara dabbed at her eyes with the handkerchief, breathing deeply to compose herself. Then, gathering her courage, she began to speak, letting the words come even though she knew they would sound wrong. "In Sweden, I could talk about anything. Books, politics, dreams. Here, I feel like I am behind a wall. I can think the words, but when I speak, they come out broken. People look at me like I am stupid, and I am not stupid." "I know you are not stupid," Thomas said immediately. "Anyone who can learn a second language is smarter than most people I know, including me. I can barely manage English, and it is the only language I have." Despite herself, Clara smiled slightly. "You speak fine." "So do you," Thomas said. "You speak just fine." "I understand every word you have said to me." Clara felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension she had been carrying for so long she had almost forgotten it was there. "Thank you," she whispered. "For saying that, for meaning it." "I do mean it," Thomas said. He picked up his fork again and resumed eating, and after a moment, Clara did the same. As the meal continued, Thomas began to tell her about the ranch, speaking in an easy, unhurried way that made it easier for Clara to relax. He told her about the cattle drives in the spring, the challenges of the harsh Montana winters, the satisfaction of seeing the herd grow year by year. He told her about his ranch hands. Ben, who was in his 50s and had worked for Thomas's father from the beginning, Miguel, a young man from Texas who was the best horse trainer Thomas had ever seen, and Jack, who was quiet but reliable and could fix anything that broke. Clara listened, asking occasional questions, and found that the more Thomas talked, the easier it became for her to respond. He never rushed her, never showed impatience when she struggled to find a word. True to his promise, he simply listened, his attention focused entirely on understanding what she was trying to communicate rather than how she sounded. "What about you?" Thomas asked as Mrs. Chen cleared their plates and brought out apple pie for dessert. "What did you dream about back in Sweden?" "What did you want from life?" Clara hesitated, then decided to trust him with the truth. "I wanted to have a family, a home. My parents, they loved each other very much. They made the decision to come to America together to build something new. They died before they could see it happen, but I still want that dream. I want to belong somewhere to build something that lasts." Thomas nodded slowly. "That is what I want too. This ranch, it is more than just land and cattle to me. It is a legacy, something to pass down to children someday, but it is lonely doing it all alone." He looked at her directly. "I will be honest with you, Miss Lindström. I am not a romantic man. I do not know how to speak pretty words or make grand gestures, but I am steady and I am loyal and I work hard. If you decide to marry me, I will do everything in my power to make you happy and keep you safe." Clara's heart beat faster. "And if I am not sure yet, if I need time—" "Then you take all the time you need," Thomas said simply. Like I said, there is no pressure. We can get to know each other properly first." They finished their dessert in a silence that felt more comfortable than before, and when Clara finally excused herself to go to bed, pleading exhaustion, Thomas simply wished her good night and told her to sleep as late as she wanted in the morning. Clara climbed the stairs to her room, her mind whirling. Thomas Garrett was not what she had expected. She had braced herself for indifference at best, disappointment at worst. Instead, she had found kindness, patience, and something that felt like genuine respect. It was more than she had dared to hope for. That night, for the first time since boarding the stagecoach in St. Louis, Clara slept deeply and without nightmares. Over the following days, a routine began to develop. Clara woke early, helped Mrs. Chen with breakfast, and then spent her mornings learning the rhythms of the ranch. Mrs. Chen was a patient teacher, showing her where everything was kept, explaining how the household ran, and sharing stories about her own journey from China to Montana 20 years earlier. "I came for the gold rush," Mrs. Chen said one morning as they kneaded bread dough together. "My husband, he wanted to strike it rich. We never found much gold, but we stayed anyway. He died 10 years ago, and Mr. Thomas's father, he gave me this job. I have been here ever since." "You miss China?" Clara asked, her hands working the dough rhythmically. "Sometimes," Mrs. Chen admitted. "But this is home now, you understand, I think. You miss Sweden?" Clara nodded. "I miss the language most, being able to say exactly what I think without struggling." Mrs. Chen smiled knowingly. "That will come. Every day it gets easier, you see." In the afternoons, Thomas would often invite Clara to walk with him around the property, pointing out various features of the ranch and introducing her to the animals. She met the ranch hands, who were all polite and respectful, touching their hat brims and welcoming her with varying degrees of shyness. Ben was gruff but kind, with a weathered face and hands like leather. Miguel was young and charming, with an easy smile and a quick laugh. Jack was indeed quiet, but Clara noticed he had gentle eyes and a way with the dogs that followed Thomas everywhere. The more time she spent with Thomas, the more Clara found herself drawn to him. He was a man of few words himself, more comfortable with action than conversation, but when he did speak, his words were thoughtful and genuine. He never made her feel rushed or stupid, and he had a way of asking questions that made it easy for her to answer. One afternoon, about a week after her arrival, Thomas took her to see his horse herd. They walked out to a large pasture where a dozen horses grazed peacefully, their coats gleaming in the sunlight. "This is my real passion," Thomas admitted, leaning against the fence rail. "The cattle pay the bills, but the horses, they are what I love. I want to build a breeding program, raise quality horses that ranchers throughout Montana will want." Clara watched the horses, admiring their strength and grace. One of them, a gray mare with a white mane, approached the fence curiously, and Clara reached out tentatively to stroke her nose. "That is Silver," Thomas said. "She is my best broodmare, smart as they come and gentle enough for a child to ride." "She is beautiful," Clara said, running her hand along Silver's neck. The horse leaned into her touch and Clara smiled. "Would you like to learn to ride?" Thomas asked, and Clara turned to him in surprise. "I have never been on a horse," she admitted. "In Sweden, my family, we did not have horses, and in New York there was no need." "Well, if you are going to live on a ranch, you should know how to ride," Thomas said. His eyes were warm with something that might have been excitement. "I could teach you if you want." Clara hesitated, fear and interest warring in her chest. "Is it difficult?" "It can be, but I would start you on the gentlest horse we have, and I would be right there with you the whole time." Thomas looked at her seriously. "But only if you want to, no pressure." Those words again, no pressure. Clara was beginning to realize that Thomas Garrett meant them every single time he said them. He was not a man who pushed or demanded. He offered and waited. "I would like to try," Clara said, making the decision suddenly. "I would like to learn." Thomas's face broke into a genuine grin, transforming him from serious to boyish in an instant. "Good. We will start tomorrow, first thing in the morning when it is still cool." True to his word, the next morning Thomas had a small bay mare named Maple saddled and waiting by the barn. Clara emerged from the house wearing one of her simpler dresses, her heart beating fast with nervousness. "First, you should meet her properly," Thomas said, bringing Clara up to Maple's head. "Let her smell you, get to know you. Horses are prey animals, so they are cautious by nature. You need to earn their trust." Clara held out her hand, and Maple sniffed it delicately before allowing Clara to stroke her face. The mare's eyes were large and liquid with long lashes, and Clara felt some of her fear melt away. "She is very sweet," Clara said. "She is the best teacher horse I have," Thomas confirmed. "Now I am going to show you how to mount." The lesson that followed was both terrifying and exhilarating. Thomas was patient, explaining each step clearly, showing her how to put her foot in the stirrup, how to pull herself up, how to settle into the saddle. He adjusted the stirrups to fit her shorter legs and showed her how to hold the reins. "The most important thing is to stay relaxed," Thomas said, one hand on Maple's bridle, the other resting reassuringly on Clara's knee. Even through her skirt, she could feel the warmth of his touch. "If you tense up, the horse will sense it and get nervous too. Just breathe and trust her." Clara tried to relax, gripping the saddle horn tightly. "I feel very high up," Thomas smiled. "You are, but I have got you. I am not going to let anything happen to you." He led Maple around the corral slowly, keeping one hand on the bridle, walking beside them. Clara clung to the saddle at first, terrified of falling, but gradually, as Maple's steady gait rocked her gently, she began to relax. Thomas kept up a stream of encouragement, his voice low and soothing. "There you go. You are doing great, just like that. Feel how she moves. You want to move with her, not fight against her." By the end of an hour, Clara was walking Maple around the corral by herself, Thomas standing in the center and calling out instructions. When he finally helped her dismount, her legs were shaky and her back ached, but she was grinning. "That was wonderful," she said, breathless. "Scary, but wonderful." Thomas looked pleased. "You are a natural. We will practice every day, and soon you will be riding all over the property." As the days turned into weeks, the riding lessons became Clara's favorite part of each day. Not just because she was learning a new skill, but because of the time it gave her alone with Thomas. When he was teaching her to ride, he was focused and patient, and Clara found herself opening up to him in ways she had not expected. One morning, as they walked the horses out to the pasture to practice in a larger space, Clara asked him about his family. "You said your father started the ranch. What was he like?" Thomas was quiet for a moment, his eyes on the horizon. "He was a hard man, but fair. He expected a lot from me, but he also taught me everything I know about ranching. He came out here after the war, the Civil War, looking for a fresh start. He had seen too much death, I think, and he wanted to build something instead of destroy." "And your mother?" "She tried her best, but she never really took to ranch life. She was a city woman from Boston originally. After my father died, there was nothing keeping her here. I do not blame her for leaving." Thomas glanced at Clara. "What about your parents?" "You said they died on the crossing, but what were they like before?" Clara felt the familiar ache of loss but pushed through it. "My father was a teacher in our village. He loved books and learning. My mother, she was strong, practical. She could do anything, sewing, cooking, managing the household money. They balanced each other well." She smiled sadly. "I think they would have loved Montana, all this space and possibility." "I think they would be proud of you," Thomas said quietly, "coming all this way on your own, starting over." "That takes courage." Clara felt tears prick her eyes but blinked them back. "Some days I do not feel very courageous, some days I feel terrified." Thomas stopped walking and turned to face her fully. "Courage is not about not feeling afraid. It is about doing what you need to do even when you are scared. You are one of the bravest people I have ever met, Clara Lindström." It was the first time he had used her given name, and hearing it in his low, warm voice made something flutter in Clara's chest. She looked up at him, at his serious face and steady eyes, and realized with a start that she was beginning to care for this man. Not just appreciate his kindness, but genuinely care about him as a person. The realization both thrilled and terrified her. That evening after dinner, Thomas invited Clara to sit with him on the front porch. The sun was setting in a blaze of color, and the air was finally cooling after the heat of the day. Mrs. Chen had gone to her small cottage behind the main house, and the ranch hands were in the bunkhouse. For the first time, Clara and Thomas were truly alone. Thomas sat in one of the rocking chairs, and Clara took the other, smoothing her skirts nervously. For a while, they simply sat in comfortable silence, watching the light change and listening to the evening sounds. Crickets chirping, a cow lowing in the distance, the rustle of wind through the grass. "I have been thinking," Thomas said finally, "that maybe it is time we talked about the future." "About what you want?" Clara's heart began to beat faster. "What I want?" "You have been here 3 weeks now," Thomas said, his eyes still on the horizon, "long enough to get a sense of what life here would be like. I do not want to pressure you, but I also do not want to keep you in uncertainty forever. So I am asking, do you think you could be happy here?" "With me?" Clara took a deep breath, gathering her thoughts. She wanted to answer honestly, but she also needed to be sure he understood. "I think I could be happy here," she said carefully. "The land, it is beautiful, Mrs. Chen is kind, the work is hard but satisfying, and you—" She paused, searching for the right words. "You have been more kind to me than anyone I have met in America. You make me feel valued, respected." Thomas turned to look at her then, his gray-blue eyes intense. But I am still afraid," Clara admitted. "I am afraid that you will grow tired of my accent, of how I speak. I am afraid that I will not be a good enough wife, that I will disappoint you. I am afraid of—" She trailed off, not sure how to express the deepest fear of all. "Afraid of what?" Thomas prompted gently. Clara forced herself to meet his eyes. "I am afraid that this will only ever be a practical arrangement, that we will live together and work together but never truly be partners. Never truly love each other." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, and Clara's heart sank. She had said too much, revealed too much. But then Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his gaze never leaving her face. "I will tell you what I am afraid of. I am afraid that you will say yes to marrying me out of obligation, or because you have nowhere else to go, not because you actually want to. I am afraid that I will not be enough for you, that you will miss the culture and education of the city and grow to resent this simple life. And I am afraid." He paused, his voice dropping. "I am afraid that I am already starting to care for you, and if you leave, it will hurt more than I want to admit." Clara's breath caught. "You are starting to care for me? How could I not?" Thomas said, a slight smile tugging at his lips. "You are brave and hardworking and kind. You are patient with Mrs. Chen, gentle with the animals, and you laugh at Miguel's terrible jokes even when you do not completely understand them. You are learning to ride even though I can tell it scares you. And when you do speak, when you trust me enough to let the words come even though you are worried about your accent, I hear someone intelligent and thoughtful and warm." He shook his head. "Your accent is not something to be ashamed of, Clara. It is beautiful. It is part of your story." Clara felt tears slide down her cheeks, but this time they were not tears of shame or fear. "I am starting to care for you too," she whispered. "I did not expect to. I thought this would be just a practical arrangement, like you said, but you make me feel safe. You make me feel like I can be myself. And when you smile at me, She stopped, embarrassed by her own boldness. "You what?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "I feel happy," Clara said simply. "Really happy for the first time since my parents died." Thomas stood slowly and moved to crouch in front of her chair, taking her hands in his. His hands were rough and calloused, but his touch was gentle. "Then let's make this official. Let's get married, Clara, not because we have to, but because we want to, because we are choosing each other." Clara looked down at their joined hands, then up at his face. In his eyes, she saw honesty and hope and something that might, in time, grow into love. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite the tears on her cheeks. "Yes, I will marry you, Thomas Garrett." Thomas's face broke into a smile so wide and genuine that it transformed him entirely. He stood, pulling her to her feet, and for a moment they simply stood there, hands clasped, grinning at each other like fools. "I should warn you," Thomas said, "I am not much for big weddings." "I was thinking maybe just the pastor and Mrs. Chen and the ranch hands as witnesses. Unless you want something different," Clara shook her head. "No, simple is good, simple is perfect." "This Saturday, then," Thomas suggested. "That will give Mrs. Chen time to prepare something special for dinner, and you can go into town if you need anything for a wedding dress." "I have my mother's shawl," Clara said. "I can wear that with my blue dress. I do not need anything else." Thomas squeezed her hands gently. "Then this Saturday it is." They stood there on the porch for a long moment, the twilight deepening around them before Thomas finally released her hands. "I should let you get some rest. I imagine you will want to write to anyone back in New York, let them know your plans." Clara nodded, though in truth there was no one in New York who cared enough about her to want the news. But she appreciated that Thomas thought there might be, that he assumed she had people who loved her. As she climbed the stairs to her room that night, Clara felt lighter than she had in years. She had made her choice, and it felt right in a way that settled deep in her bones. The next few days passed in a blur of preparation. Mrs. Chen threw herself into planning a wedding dinner with the enthusiasm of someone planning a royal banquet. She shooed Clara out of the kitchen, insisting that the bride should not be doing chores in the days before her wedding. Instead, Clara spent her time taking longer rides with Thomas, exploring more of the ranch property. He showed her the creek that ran through the eastern section of the land, a beautiful spot with cottonwood trees and smooth rocks perfect for sitting. He showed her the high pasture where the cattle spent the summer, and the line of mountains in the distance that marked the western boundary of his land. On one of these rides, they encountered a small herd of deer, and Clara gasped in delight as the graceful animals bounded away across the grass. Thomas watched her face, smiling at her obvious pleasure. "You really do love it here," he observed. "I do," Clara confirmed. "It is so different from anything I have ever known, but it feels right. Does that make sense?" "Perfect sense," Thomas said. "That is how I have always felt about this place." On Friday, the day before the wedding, Clara rode into town with Thomas in the wagon to speak with Pastor Richardson and to pick up a few supplies. The pastor was a kindly middle-aged man with a shock of white hair and a booming voice. He seemed delighted by the news of the wedding and promised to arrive at the ranch by 2 o'clock the next afternoon. After visiting the pastor, Thomas took Clara to the general store. "Pick out anything you need," he said, "or anything you want. Consider it a wedding gift." Clara wandered through the store, running her hands over bolts of fabric, examining jars of preserves and sacks of flour. In the end, she chose a length of white ribbon to tie back her hair for the wedding and a small journal with a leather cover. "What is the journal for?" Thomas asked as they loaded their purchases into the wagon. "To write in," Clara said. "I used to keep a journal in Swedish, but I stopped after my parents died. I think I would like to start again, but this time in English, to practice and also to record this new life." Thomas smiled. "I think that is a fine idea." As they drove back to the ranch, Clara felt a flutter of nervousness mixing with her excitement. Tomorrow she would become Mrs. Thomas Garrett. Tomorrow her new life would truly begin. That night, Mrs. Chen helped Clara wash her hair, heating buckets of water and pouring them over Clara's head while Clara knelt beside the bathtub. Afterward, Clara sat by the fire in her nightgown while Mrs. Chen combed out the long blonde strands, humming a Chinese lullaby under her breath. "You are happy, Mrs. Chen asked softly. "I am," Clara said, and realized she meant it completely. "I did not think I would be, but I am." "Mr. Thomas is a good man," Mrs. Chen said. "He will take care of you." "I know," Clara said, "and I will take care of him too, Mrs. Chen smiled, her weathered face crinkling with pleasure. "Yes, that is how it should be." Saturday dawned clear and beautiful, with a bright blue sky and a gentle breeze that kept the heat at bay. Clara woke early, too excited and nervous to sleep, and spent the morning helping Mrs. Chen with last-minute preparations despite the housekeeper's protests. At noon, Mrs. Chen ordered Clara upstairs to get ready. Clara bathed, then put on her best dress, the dark blue cotton that brought out the color of her eyes. She draped her mother's shawl over her shoulders, the fine white wool embroidered with delicate flowers in blue thread. She braided her hair and pinned it up, weaving in the white ribbon she had bought the day before, and studied her reflection in the mirror. She looked like a bride, she decided. Not a fancy city bride with silk and lace, but a frontier bride, simple and sincere. It felt right. At 2 o'clock she heard the sounds of arrival downstairs. Pastor Richardson's booming voice, the deeper tones of the ranch hands, and underneath it all, Thomas's steady presence. Clara took a deep breath, said a silent prayer to her parents, and headed downstairs. Thomas was waiting at the bottom of the stairs, and when he looked up and saw her, his expression made Clara's breath catch. There was wonder in his eyes and warmth and something that might have been love beginning to bloom. He was dressed in his best clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, a black vest, and a string tie. His hair was slicked back, still damp from washing, and he had shaved carefully. He looked handsome and nervous and dear, all at once. "You look beautiful," he said as she reached the bottom step, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Thank you," Clara whispered. "You look very handsome." Thomas offered her his arm, and Clara took it, feeling the solid strength of him beneath her hand. Together, they walked into the living room where Pastor Richardson waited with his Bible, flanked by Mrs. Chen, Ben, Miguel, and Jack, all dressed in their Sunday best. The ceremony was simple and brief. Pastor Richardson read from Corinthians about love being patient and kind, then asked Thomas and Clara to join hands and repeat their vows. When it came time for Clara to speak, she felt the familiar flutter of anxiety, worried that her accent would mar this important moment. But then she looked up at Thomas and saw only encouragement and love in his eyes. She remembered his words, "Say anything and I will listen." So she spoke, her voice clear and steady despite her accent, promising to love and honor and cherish Thomas Garrett for all the days of her life. And when Thomas spoke his own vows, promising to protect and provide for and treasure her always, Clara felt tears of joy slide down her cheeks. Pastor Richardson pronounced them husband and wife, and Thomas leaned down to kiss her gently, sweetly, a kiss full of promise and new beginnings. The small gathering erupted in cheers and applause, and Clara found herself laughing and crying at the same time. Mrs. Chen had outdone herself with the wedding dinner. There was roasted chicken and ham, fresh bread, 3 kinds of vegetables, potatoes creamed and seasoned to perfection, and a beautiful cake with white frosting that must have taken hours to prepare. They all sat around the table, and the ranch hands told stories about Thomas as a younger man, some embarrassing, some heroic, all told with obvious affection. Miguel played guitar and sang Spanish love songs, and even Jack, quiet Jack, stood up to toast the bride and groom, wishing them happiness and many years together. Clara felt surrounded by warmth and goodwill, and for the first time since leaving Sweden, she felt like she was truly part of a family. As the sun began to set and the guests prepared to leave, Thomas took Clara's hand and led her out to the front porch. Pastor Richardson had already departed, and the ranch hands were heading back to the bunkhouse, calling out final congratulations. "Are you tired?" Thomas asked, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on the back of her hand. "A little," Clara admitted. "But happy." Thomas nodded, looking suddenly nervous. "I know we have taken things slowly, but we are married now, and he trailed off, color rising in his cheeks. Clara understood what he was trying to say and felt her own cheeks warm. "I am your wife now," she said softly. "I want to be your wife in every way." Thomas let out a breath, looking relieved. "I will be gentle," he promised, "and patient. We can take as much time as you need." Clara rose on her tiptoes and kissed him, a gesture that still felt new and thrilling. "I trust you," she said simply. Thomas led her upstairs, not to her old room but to his room at the end of the hall. It was larger than hers, with a big bed covered in a dark quilt, sturdy furniture, and windows overlooking the corrals and barn. A lamp burned low on the bedside table, casting warm shadows. Thomas closed the door behind them and turned to Clara, his hands settling gently on her waist. "I have thought about this," he admitted, his voice low and rough. "About you, about us together. But I want this to be good for you, Clara. I want you to feel cherished." Clara reached up and touched his face, feeling the slight roughness of stubble already beginning to grow back. "You make me feel cherished every day," she said. "In the way you listen to me, in the way you look at me, in your patience and kindness. I am not afraid, Thomas, not of this." Thomas kissed her then, deeper than before, and Clara felt heat bloom through her body. His hands were careful as he helped her remove her dress, as he laid her down on the bed and showed her, with touches and whispers and gentle passion, what it meant to be loved by a good man. Later, much later, Clara lay in Thomas's arms, her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. The lamp had burned down to nothing, and moonlight streamed through the windows, painting everything silver. "Are you all right?" Thomas asked softly, his hand stroking her hair. "I am more than all right," Clara said, pressing a kiss to his chest. "I am happy." Thomas tightened his arms around her. "So am I, happier than I thought possible." Clara smiled in the darkness. She had come to Montana terrified and alone, sure that she would never fit in, never belong. But here, in this man's arms, in this place she was already coming to love, she had found something she had thought lost forever: home. The summer passed in a haze of happiness and hard work. Clara threw herself into learning everything she could about running the ranch household. Mrs. Chen taught her to cook the foods Thomas liked, to manage the household accounts, to preserve vegetables for the winter. Clara also continued her riding lessons, and within a few months, she was confident enough to ride out alone to bring Thomas lunch when he was working in the far pastures. Thomas, for his part, seemed to grow more relaxed and open with each passing week. He smiled more, laughed more readily, and seemed to take genuine pleasure in having Clara by his side. In the evenings, they would sit together on the porch, and Thomas would tell her about his day while Clara worked on her sewing or wrote in her journal. On Sundays, they would drive into town for church, and Clara gradually got to know the other townspeople. Some were friendly, some were standoffish, but Clara found that she cared less and less what strangers thought. She had Thomas, she had Mrs. Chen, she had the ranch hands who had become like brothers to her. That was enough. One evening in late August, Clara realized that her monthly courses had not come. She waited another week, not wanting to say anything until she was certain, but when the second week passed with no sign, she finally told Thomas. They were in the barn, where Thomas was checking on a mare who was due to foal soon. Clara had come out to help, carrying a lantern, and the warm smell of hay and horses surrounded them. "Thomas," Clara said, her voice shaking slightly, "I need to tell you something." Thomas looked up from examining the mare's legs, his face immediately concerned. "What is wrong? Are you ill?" "No, not ill," Clara said quickly. I think I might be pregnant." Thomas froze, his eyes going wide. "Pregnant, are you sure?" "Not completely sure," Clara admitted. "But my courses have not come and I feel different. Tired and my breasts are tender. I think we are going to have a baby." For a moment, Thomas simply stared at her and Clara felt a flicker of worry. But then his face broke into the widest grin she had ever seen, and he crossed the barn in 3 long strides, sweeping her up into his arms and spinning her around. "We are going to have a baby," he shouted, his voice echoing in the barn rafters. "Clara, we are going to have a baby." Clara laughed, clutching at his shoulders. "Put me down, you will make me dizzy." Thomas set her down carefully, then cupped her face in his hands and kissed her thoroughly. "This is the best news, the very best news. When do you think the baby will come?" "If I am right about when it happened, maybe April or May," Clara said, her hand going instinctively to her still flat stomach. "But we should have the doctor confirm it." "Tomorrow," Thomas said immediately. "We will go to town tomorrow and see Dr. Mitchell, but I know you are right." "I can see it in your face, you are glowing," Clara laughed, feeling giddy with happiness and relief at his reaction. "I was worried you might think it was too soon." "Too soon," Thomas shook his head. "Clara, a child is a blessing always, and a child with you, that is more than I ever dreamed of." True to his word, they went to town the next day and Dr. Mitchell confirmed what Clara already knew. She was about 2 months pregnant, and if all went well, the baby would arrive in late April or early May. The pregnancy progressed smoothly. Clara suffered from morning sickness for a few weeks, and Thomas would hold her hair back and bring her cool cloths for her forehead, murmuring comfort. As her belly began to swell, he became almost comically protective, trying to stop her from doing any heavy work, though Clara insisted she was perfectly capable of carrying on as normal for now. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time," Clara told him, laughing at his worried face. "I am not made of glass." "I know," Thomas said, "but you are precious to me. I cannot help but worry." As autumn turned to winter and the Montana landscape became blanketed in snow, Clara and Thomas spent their evenings planning for the baby. Thomas began building a cradle in the barn, carving it from smooth pine and sanding it until it was soft as silk. Mrs. Chen helped Clara sew tiny clothes and blankets, and the ranch hands all seemed excited about the impending arrival, though they tried to hide it behind gruff comments about the ranch getting too noisy. Christmas came, and Clara celebrated her first American Christmas with a full heart. She and Mrs. Chen prepared a feast, and the ranch hands joined them for dinner. Thomas gave Clara a beautiful wool cloak he had bought from a traveling merchant, lined with fur to keep her warm during the cold winter months. Clara gave him a new hat she had sewn herself and a book of poetry she had ordered from St. Louis. "I know you said you are not a romantic man," Clara said as Thomas opened the book and looked through it, "but I thought maybe you would like to read to me sometimes. To practice reading aloud before the baby comes." Thomas pulled her close, his hand resting on her swollen belly. "I will read you all the poetry you want," he promised. And that night, he kept his promise, his deep voice stumbling over some of the more complex words but filling their bedroom with the music of verses about love and nature and beauty. Winter in Montana was harsh, with deep snows and bitter cold, but the house was warm and well built, and Clara found she did not mind being snowed in for days at a time. It gave her and Thomas even more time together, playing cards, reading, planning for the future. In February, Clara turned 23, and Thomas surprised her with a birthday cake Mrs. Chen had somehow managed to make despite the limited ingredients available in winter. He also gave her a beautiful hand-drawn map of the ranch, with all the features labeled and little drawings of the animals and buildings. "I thought you might like to have it," Thomas said, "to show our child someday, to say this is the land where you were born, where your family has roots." Clara cried, of course, and Thomas held her while she sobbed happy tears into his shirt. Spring came slowly, the snow melting in patches, revealing brown grass that would soon turn green again. Clara's belly was huge now, and she moved carefully, her back aching and her feet swollen. But she had never felt more content, more certain that she was exactly where she was supposed to be in late April, on a warm morning with the smell of new grass and flowers in the air. Clara's labor began. Mrs. Chen sent Thomas to fetch Dr. Mitchell while she stayed with Clara, timing the contractions and offering words of encouragement. The labor lasted through the day and into the night, and Clara had never known such pain. But Mrs. Chen and Thomas, who refused to leave her side despite the doctor's suggestion that the birthing room was no place for a man, supported her through every contraction, every push. Finally, just as the sun was rising the next morning, Clara gave birth to a healthy baby boy. Dr. Mitchell cleaned the baby and wrapped him in a blanket, then placed him in Clara's arms. Thomas knelt beside the bed, his eyes wet with tears as they looked down at their son together. "He is perfect," Thomas whispered, gently touching the baby's tiny hand. The baby's fingers curled around Thomas's finger, and Thomas let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. He is absolutely perfect. What should we name him? Clara asked, exhausted but radiant. Thomas thought for a moment. What was your father's name? Eric, Clara said. Eric Lindström. Then let's call him Eric, Thomas said. Eric Thomas Garrett, to honor where he came from and where he is going. Clara smiled, tears sliding down her cheeks. Eric Thomas Garrett, welcome to the world, little one. The first few weeks with baby Eric were exhausting but joyful. He was a good baby, healthy and strong-lunged, and Clara marveled at how much she could love this tiny person she had only just met. Thomas was a devoted father, taking every opportunity to hold his son, walking him around the house when he fussed, singing to him in his deep, rumbling voice. The ranch hands all came to visit, bearing gifts. A carved wooden horse from Jack, a soft blanket from Miguel's mother who lived in town, and a tiny pair of leather boots from Ben, who gruffly said that the boy would need them when he started walking. As spring turned to summer, Clara's life fell into a new rhythm. She would rise early to feed Eric, then pass him to Thomas or Mrs. Chen while she helped with the household tasks. Thomas had hired a young woman from town to help Mrs. Chen a few days a week, giving Clara more time to rest and recover from the birth. By Eric's first birthday, Clara had completely adjusted to her new life. Her English had improved dramatically, though she still spoke with an accent, and she no longer felt embarrassed by it. Thomas had been right. What mattered was what she said, not how she said it. The townspeople had accepted her, the ranch was prospering, and her little family was healthy and happy. On Eric's birthday, they had a party with cake and presents. Eric, wearing a little suit Clara had sewn for the occasion, sat in his high chair and smashed his hands into a small cake Mrs. Chen had made just for him, his face lighting up with delight. Everyone laughed at his antics, and Clara felt her heart swell with love for all of them. That night, after Eric was asleep and the house was quiet, Clara and Thomas sat on the front porch as they had done so many times before. Thomas pulled Clara close and she rested her head on his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of him, leather and soap in the outdoors. Are you happy? Thomas asked, the same question he had asked so many times over the years. I am, Clara said, and it was true in a way she had never imagined possible. I have everything I ever wanted. So do I, Thomas said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. So do I. The years passed peacefully. Eric grew into a sturdy, curious boy with his father's dark hair and his mother's blue eyes. When he was 3, Clara gave birth to a daughter they named Anna, after Thomas's mother. Anna was a sunny-natured child with blonde curls and a smile that could light up a room. The ranch continued to prosper. Thomas's horse breeding program took off, and ranchers from across Montana came to buy his horses. They added more land, more cattle, and eventually built a new, larger barn. Ben retired, and Miguel took over as foreman, proving himself more than capable. Jack stayed on, as steady and reliable as ever, and Clara came to think of all the ranch hands, old and new, as extended family. Mrs. Chen continued to be Clara's closest confidante and friend, and as the older woman aged, Clara took on more and more of the household management, though Mrs. Chen still insisted on making special dishes for holidays and birthdays. Clara's English became fluent, though she never lost her accent, and she found that she had stopped caring. Thomas had been right all along. It was part of her story, part of who she was, and there was no shame in it. She even began teaching Eric and Anna to speak Swedish, wanting them to know that part of their heritage. When Eric was 7 and Anna was 4, Clara gave birth to twin boys, Jacob and Samuel. The household became even more chaotic and joyful, and Clara often fell into bed exhausted at the end of the day, only to wake in the night to feed the babies. But Thomas was always there, helping where he could, taking Eric and Anna on adventures to give Clara time to rest, proving himself to be the partner Clara had hoped for but hardly dared to dream of. The children grew, and the ranch grew with them. Eric showed a natural talent for working with horses, just like his father, and by the time he was 10, he was already helping with the training. Anna loved to cook and spent hours in the kitchen with Mrs. Chen, learning to make both American and Chinese dishes. The twins were wild and adventurous, always getting into mischief, but their laughter filled the house with warmth. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Thomas took Clara back to the spot by the creek where he had first told her he was starting to care for her. It was summer, and wildflowers bloomed everywhere, painting the landscape in brilliant colors. "I wanted to bring you back here," Thomas said, helping Clara sit on one of the smooth rocks. "To the place where I first admitted to myself that I was falling in love with you." Clara smiled, reaching for his hand. "I think I fell in love with you the first night we had dinner together when you told me to say anything and you would listen. You saw me, Thomas. You saw me when I felt invisible." Thomas squeezed her hand. "You could never be invisible, not to me." They sat by the creek for a while, listening to the water and watching the sky, before Thomas pulled something from his pocket. It was a small wooden box, carved with intricate designs. "I made this for you," he said, opening it to reveal a silver locket on a delicate chain. "It has pictures of all 4 children inside. I wanted you to have something to mark 10 years together, 10 years of building this life." Clara took the locket with trembling hands, opening it to see the tiny photographs Thomas must have commissioned in town. Tears streamed down her face as she looked at the faces of her children, her family, the life she had built with this good man. "It is beautiful," she whispered. "Thank you." Thomas fastened the locket around her neck, then pulled her close. "Thank you for saying yes. Thank you for choosing me, for choosing this life. I know it is not always easy, and I know you have sacrificed a lot." Clara shook her head. "I have sacrificed nothing. I have gained everything." More years passed, and the children continued to grow. Eric fell in love with a rancher's daughter from the next county over, a smart, capable young woman named Sarah who fit right into the family. They married when Eric was 22, and Clara wept happy tears to see her son so clearly in love, so clearly cherished by his bride. Anna showed a talent for teaching and went to school in Helena to get her teaching certificate, eventually returning to Silver Bend to teach at the local school. The twins grew into tall, strapping young men who helped run the ranch with increasing skill and responsibility. Mrs. Chen passed away peacefully in her sleep when Clara was 38, and the entire family mourned her loss. They buried her in the small cemetery outside town, and Clara made sure there were fresh flowers on her grave every week. Without Mrs. Chen, Clara felt the loss of the woman who had become like a mother to her, the woman who had understood what it was like to be a stranger in a strange land. Thomas's hair began to gray at the temples, and laugh lines appeared around his eyes. Clara found silver threads in her own blonde hair and noticed that her hands were becoming rougher, more worn from years of work. But when she looked in the mirror, she did not see someone defeated by time. She saw a woman who had lived a full life, who had loved and been loved in return. On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party. Eric and Sarah came with their 2 children, Clara's grandchildren, a boy named Thomas and a girl named Clara. Anna came with her husband, a quiet accountant she had met in Helena. The twins brought their latest girlfriends, and the house was full of people and noise and laughter. After the party, after everyone had left and the house was quiet again, Thomas led Clara out to the porch. It was summer again, the same season in which they had married, and the air was warm and sweet with the scent of flowers. 25 years, Thomas said, shaking his head in wonder. "Where did the time go?" "I do not know," Clara admitted. "It feels like yesterday that I stepped off that stagecoach, terrified and alone, and now look at us, grandparents." Thomas laughed. "We are getting old, Clara. We are," Clara agreed, "but I would not change a single thing." Thomas turned to her, taking both her hands in his. "Do you remember what I told you that first night, that I was not a romantic man, that I did not know how to speak pretty words?" Clara nodded. "I remember." "I still do not know how to speak pretty words," Thomas said, "but I know how to tell the truth. And the truth is that you are the best thing that ever happened to me." Marrying you, building this life with you, watching you become a mother and now a grandmother, it has been the greatest privilege of my life. I love you, Clara Garrett. I have loved you since the beginning, and I will love you until the end. Clara felt tears slip down her cheeks as they had so many times over the years, but these were tears of pure joy. I love you too, Thomas. You gave me a home when I had none. You gave me a family. You gave me a life I never dreamed possible. You saw me when I felt invisible, and you loved me even when I could not love myself. That is the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. Thomas pulled her close, and they stood there on the porch, holding each other as the sun set over the ranch they had built together, over the land that had become their legacy. More years passed, each one bringing new joys and new challenges. Eric took over more and more of the ranch management, as Thomas's arthritis made it harder for him to do the physical work. Anna had 3 children of her own, and the twins eventually settled down, one marrying a doctor's daughter from town, the other finding love with a widow who ran the town's bakery. Clara continued to write in her journal, filling volume after volume with the story of her life. She wrote in English now, though occasionally she would slip in a Swedish word or phrase when English failed to capture exactly what she meant. She wrote about her children and grandchildren, about the changing seasons, about the moments of quiet beauty that made up a life. Thomas's health began to decline when he was in his early 60s. The arthritis spread, and he developed a persistent cough that the doctor said was from years of breathing in dust during cattle drives. But he remained cheerful, insisting that he had lived a good life and had no regrets. On a spring morning when Thomas was 64 and Clara was 56, Clara woke to find Thomas breathing shallowly beside her. She called for Eric immediately and the doctor was summoned, but there was little anyone could do. Thomas's heart was giving out. The family gathered around his bed, all the children and grandchildren crowding into the room. Thomas smiled at each of them, speaking words of love and encouragement, telling them how proud he was of the people they had become. Finally, he asked everyone to give him a moment alone with Clara. They filed out reluctantly, and Clara took Thomas's hand, tears streaming down her face. "Do not cry," Thomas said, his voice weak but steady. "We had a good run, did we not?" "The best," Clara said, her voice breaking. "I do not want to let you go." "You are not letting me go," Thomas said. "I will always be with you. In the land, in the children, in every sunset and every morning. This place, Clara, it is us. It is our love made real, and it will go on." Clara pressed her forehead to his hand, sobbing, I love you so much." "I know," Thomas said, "and I love you." "My mail-order bride with the beautiful accent. My Clara, thank you for saying yes, thank you for choosing me." Those were his last words. He died peacefully an hour later, surrounded by his family with Clara holding his hand. The grief was overwhelming. Clara felt as though a part of her had been torn away, leaving a wound that would never fully heal. But she was not alone. Her children surrounded her with love, and her grandchildren, now numbering 8, brought light and laughter back into the house gradually. Eric and Sarah moved into the main house to help run the ranch and to keep Clara company. Anna visited frequently, and the twins made sure to stop by at least once a week. Life continued, as it always does, and Clara found that Thomas had been right. He was still with her, in the land they had built together, in the legacy they had created. Clara lived another 15 years after Thomas's death, dying peacefully in her sleep at the age of 71. In those years, she saw 2 more great-grandchildren born, saw the ranch continue to prosper under Eric's management, and saw Silver Bend grow from a small frontier town into a thriving community. She never remarried, never even considered it. Thomas Garrett had been the love of her life, her partner, her home. She had been blessed beyond measure to have found him, to have built a life with him. On the day of Clara's funeral, the church in Silver Bend was packed with people. Her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren were all there, along with townspeople whose lives she had touched over the years. The pastor spoke of her kindness, her strength, her devotion to her family. He spoke of the journey she had made from Sweden to Montana, and how she had transformed from a frightened young woman into a pillar of the community. They buried her beside Thomas in the cemetery outside town, under a large cottonwood tree. Her headstone was simple. Clara Lindström Garrett, 1860 to 1931, beloved wife, mother, grandmother, say anything, and I will listen. Eric stood at the grave long after everyone else had left, his own children and grandchildren waiting patiently by the wagon. He thought about his parents, about the love story they had lived, about the legacy they had left behind. The ranch was thriving, home now to 3 generations of Garretts. The land that Thomas had worked so hard to build up had been passed down and would continue to be passed down. The values his parents had instilled, the importance of hard work, kindness, and family, lived on in all of them. Eric remembered something his mother had told him once when he was a boy and had asked about her accent. She had smiled and said that his father had taught her that it did not matter how you sounded when you spoke, what mattered was what was in your heart. That lesson had shaped Eric's life, had made him the man he was. As the sun set over the ranch in the distance, painting the sky in brilliant colors, Eric said a final goodbye to his mother and walked back to his family. Life would go on as his father had promised, and the love his parents had shared would continue to echo through the generations, a testament to the power of seeing someone truly, of listening with patience, and of choosing love even in the face of fear. The story of Clara and Thomas Garrett became a family legend, told and retold to each new generation. It was a story about courage and kindness, about building something lasting from simple beginnings, and about the transformative power of being truly seen and loved for who you are. It was a reminder that sometimes the greatest love stories are not the flashiest or most dramatic, but the ones built on quiet, daily acts of devotion, on promises kept and patience given freely. And in Silver Bend, Montana, for many years after both Clara and Thomas were gone, people still spoke of the mail-order bride with the beautiful accent and the cowboy who had loved her exactly as she was, who had said those simple, powerful words that changed both their lives forever. Say anything, and I will listen.